Hello, today we are talking about symbols of formal logic and conditionals. So here we have the symbols that we will need to know. P, Q, R, they're just going to be letters that represent an actual statement. And if you look kind of below, you can see let P means it rains on Friday. So anytime you see P, that really means it rains on Friday. The next statement that we have is this arrow, and it is a conditional statement, which means it's an if-then statement. Next, we have a biconditional, and whenever you see that, that is an if and only if, and shorthand we will write IFF, means if and only if. The little tilde, that means not. It means the opposite of whatever I was trying to say. For example, in this let P equal it rains on Friday, if I saw not P, that means it does not rain on Friday. Next we have the three dots. The three dots means therefore. That's all it is. Those three dots mean therefore. We have the intersection, which means and as well, and an intersection of the same thing. We also have this symbol, which means union, and that is the same as an or statement. So let's look at the examples that we have right here. And I'm going to go through each one of these so you can see how we determine what kind of symbol we're using. So first I notice I have an if-then. Once I know I have an if-then, I know that I'm going to be having a single arrow. I just go back and look at my list, and that circled in blue at the top is an implies or an if-then statement. So then I have it rains on Friday. Well, I found that already. It rains on Friday is P. So the P goes in front, and then I have the football game is postponed, and that is my Q. So I'd write it like this, which I would read that if P, then Q. I could also read it as P implies Q. So for the next one, I don't see an if. There's no if at the beginning of number 2, but I do see this, and that is my if and only if. That is your double arrow. Next, I look at the front, and I have the football game is postponed. That is right here, and that's statement Q. And the next thing that I have is it rains on Friday, and that is my, sorry, blue. It rains on Friday, and that is my P. Number 3, I do not see an if statement again. I do see an if statement. If, then, which means I have an arrow going towards the right. The football game is not postponed. Ooh, that's almost Q, except I have this not right here. If the football game is not postponed, that's the same as saying tilde Q. So tilde Q, which is read not Q, then it rains on Friday. It rains on Friday is P, so P goes at the end. Next one, I do not have an if statement in there. The statement that I have is an and going back up to my list, and is right here, and that is the upside down V. So I have an upside down V, and it does not rain on Friday. So that's close to my P except for this word not right here, which tells me I'm going to have this tilde and then the P. So tilde P, and I read that as not P. Then the football game, and the football game is not postponed, and there's that not again, so I have a not Q for that. So I would read that not P and not Q. Next, I don't have an if statement again. I have an or. The or, going back up to my list, the or right here is a V. So I'm going to use the V, and the beginning is the football game is postponed, and that part is my Q. And then I have it does not rain on Friday, so that's almost my P, except it's got a not there, so not P. So at this point, what I would like for you to do, I would like for you to complete the numbers 6 through 10, and then what should be 11, and 12. So I'd like you to complete until you get to a new P. So please pause the video now and complete these problems. Here are the solutions. So what I'd like for you to do is pause the video now and check all of your answers. Please try and correct any mistakes you make and bring any questions you have to class. So please pause the video now to check your answers. Now we have a new P and a new Q, and we've been given the symbolic notation, and what we have to do now is go backwards and write the statement. So let's look at the first one. The first one, I look at that middle symbol, and this thing right here tells me that I have an if-then statement. So I'm going to start with if. And the next thing I have is I have Q right here, which is cows make milk. So if cows make milk, and then I know it's an if-then statement, then I have not P. So how do I not the P? So the P is the moon is blue. If I not it, then the moon is not blue. So what I'd like you to do right now is I would like you to try the next one. So please pause the video now and try the next one. So my statement is the moon is blue if and only if cows do not make milk. Again, try and correct that or bring any questions to class. The next one, we have the symbol in the middle tells me that I'm going to have an or, and I'm starting with P. So the moon is blue, or Q, which is cows make milk. So what I'd like you to do right now is I would like for you to try the next one. So please pause the video now and do that last one on that page. So the last one is the moon is not blue and cows make milk. Now you do need to memorize these symbols, so let's go back up to the top and let's be sure that you write that you need to memorize these. Okay, all of those you just need to know. So we're going to go ahead and move on to the next page now. And so now we're talking about conditionals. Now a conditional statement is simply an if-then statement. And the format that we've already seen is P arrow Q, and that means if P, then Q, whatever P represents and whatever Q represents. So the other way that we can say it is we have if, and then we have the hypothesis. In our case, hypothesis would be the P. Then we have Q, and Q would be called the conclusion. So for the hypothesis of an if-then statement, that's the sentence between the if and the then. So let's go ahead and write that down. It's a sentence all by itself, and it is between the words if and then in a conditional. Now, if I'm writing too fast for you, pause when I'm finished so that you can continue writing so you don't miss the next thing that I do. The conclusion is the sentence that comes after the word then. So the conclusion is the sentence that comes after the word then in a conditional. Again, if you need to pause the video because I was writing too fast, pause the video and go ahead and write the rest of that down. Moving on to the example. In this example, we're going to underline the hypothesis. Sorry. We're going to underline the hypothesis, and we are going to circle the conclusion in this statement. So when I underline this, it's the sentence between the if and then. So there is an earthquake. That's my hypothesis. And the conclusion is that part that comes after the word then. It's going to be the building shakes. So true or false? The word if is part of the hypothesis of a conditional statement. That is actually false. If is not part of your hypothesis. The next one, the word then is part of the conclusion of the conditional statement. That is also false. Then is not part of the conclusion. So the words if and then are not part of your hypothesis, and they are not part of your conclusion. So what I'd like you to do right now is this one labeled you try. Given P, the phone rings, and Q, stars twinkle, I would like for you to write these two statements. So this is just like what we were doing earlier. So pause the video now and complete the you try, please. So for part A, I got if the phone rings, then stars twinkle. And for part B, if stars do not twinkle, then the phone rings. So go ahead and make any corrections that you need to, write down any questions that you have, and pause the video as you do so. I'm moving on to the different conditional statements. So these, again, are things that you need to memorize. We need to know what these mean. So what this means is if I start with just any conditional statement, P is my hypothesis and Q is my conclusion, then whenever I want to talk about the converse of any conditional, what happened with my P and my Q? Well, I switched them. So for the converse, you're going to switch your hypothesis and conclusion. So we switched our P and our Q, which means you switch the hypothesis and the conclusion. Again, that's the converse, and that is one you need to memorize. Next, we have the inverse. And if you look at the inverse, it looks a lot like the initial conditional with P, then Q, except that we have these little tildes in front, which means we not P and Q, which means you not the hypothesis and the conclusion. You not them both. Contrapositive, again, just like in the inverse, I have the nots in front, and just like in the converse, I have them switched. So the contrapositive is both doing the converse and the inverse to a conditional. So what we do for this one is we switch and not your P and Q, which means you switch and not the hypothesis and the conclusion. And again, if I'm writing too fast, pause the video so that you can write down what I've written down without missing anything else. So what we're going to do next is we're going to practice. Again, pause the video if you're still writing. So we're starting with a conditional statement. If an angle is a right angle, then its measure is 90 degrees. So the first thing we're going to do is write the converse. So initially my statement is P, if P, then Q. So again, my P is this, and my Q is this. So for our converse, what we're going to do is we're going to switch those. So for my converse, it's going to be if, is how I'm going to start still, and angles measure is 90 degrees. Now I need to start with, instead of saying if its measure is 90 degrees, I should really start with what it is, which is an angle. And that's just how you write an if-then statement. The angle would be written in the hypothesis part. So if an angle's measure is 90 degrees, then now I can use the word it. It is a right angle. Again, if I'm writing too fast, pause the video so that you can get that all down. So next we're going to write the inverse. Now the inverse is just a not of each one. So we're going to have not P implies not Q. So we start with the word if, and then I'm going to not the P, which means I'm going to have an angle is not a right angle. Then its measure is not 90 degrees. So now we're on to the contrapositive. And again, if you need more time, pause your video. In the contrapositive, we're going to do both. We're going to not each thing. We're going to have an if-then statement. But we're also going to switch the hypothesis and the conclusion. So let's go ahead and start with our if. And I have the opposite of Q. So if an angle's measure is not 90 degrees, then it is not a right angle. So again, the contrapositive is the one most people remember because you do both. You just switch it and you nod it. You don't even have to think too much. Okay, for the next thing, if the conditional statement and the blank are both true, then the statement can be written as a biconditional. Your biconditional that is your if and only if. It is, sorry, your if and only if, which you can also write as if and only if, which you can also write symbolically like this. So that means if I start with the hypothesis, I'm going to end with the conclusion. That should be true. But also, if I start with the conclusion, I should end with the hypothesis, and that should also be true. So to fill in this missing blank, if the conditional statement and the converse are both true, then the statement can be written as a biconditional. So we're going to write the biconditional for the previous problem. So for the biconditional, the converse was if an angle's measure is 90 degrees, then it is a right angle. So first of all, is that a true statement? Well, yeah, that's the definition of a right angle. So let's start with the initial conditional, which was given in the example. If an angle is a right angle, then its measure is 90 degrees. That's also the definition. So I can write this as a biconditional. So an angle is a right angle if and only if it measures 90 degrees. So when I have the original statement as a true statement and the converse is a true statement, I can write that as a biconditional. That's the only time that you can do a biconditional statement. So this last thing is actually an important little nugget that we need to remember, memorize. anytime the conditional statement is true, then one of the three, converse, inverse, and contrapositive, will also be true. And that one is going to be the contrapositive. Okay, so anytime the conditional statement is true, the contrapositive is also a true statement. So that's the end of your video lesson for tonight. Please bring any questions that you have to class and have a wonderful evening.